emotional intelligence. A conservative estimate, it's actually getting more and more, but a conservative estimate is at least half of the participants that are in significant need of our program and come to our program have a very a contributing factor, large contributing factor has to do with this subject right here. And we don't address the subject with the entire group till we're about halfway through. We want their frontal lobes to be enhanced. We want them to be on good behavioral things where their brain is working well. If your brain is not working well, you can get triggered by truth. and then we present it all from the scientific standpoint. Although it could be stated coming from the biblical standpoint as well. We'll actually talk about both here, but maybe not the full science. In fact, if I were to get into the full science, which we actually teach in a subject or a course that I teach called Lifestyle Treatments of Disease at Weimar University, all of the bachelor students have to go through that. And this will actually be, when we look at the science of these sexual issues of today, it's actually 4 days where we're going over the scientific studies on all of this. And so our students can be very clear about what the science actually shows. And they can also discern when they start hearing false science, how that false science is being represented, and how it's actually very much against the actual data. Often when it comes to these things and pop culture tries to utilize science to support their beliefs, they'll have some sort of scientist pontificate on it, but they won't be showing you data. Or they won't be showing you data in regards to long-term data. They like to make it very, very short-term. Because, you know, just like an alcoholic, when they have anxiety, while they're under the influence of alcohol, their anxiety gets better. That's not a sign that alcohol is good for anxiety. Because what is it doing in regards to the long-term effects? So those are all things that we discuss, and of course we also discuss how true science actually lines up completely with the Word of God. Of course, he's the author of science, and he is the author of truth, and Weimar still stands today as uncompromisingly scientific and unapologetically biblical. And I really don't think you can be uncompromisingly scientific unless you are unapologetically biblical, because inspiration can help you with insights in science that if the, you know, and often the scientists try to say that if you are using another source of authority, that's not really true science. But you know, how many times has, quotes, science changed their positions on a whole host of issues? And the Bible does not change. Those principles are timeless and stand the test of time. So let's get into some of the science. Phenylethylamine is the love chemical. It's a chemical that speeds up the flow of information between nerve cells. Professor Robert Fryer, Ferris State University in Michigan, explains falling in love involves phenylethylamine, or PEA, which causes a person to be less likely to be aware of the faults of the other person. Phenylethylamine gives us that euphoric high, that feel good, everything is wonderful, this person can do no wrong. We've oftentimes seen people who fall in love with somebody and ask, "Are you blind?" Well, yes, they really are blind. And almost no one can tell them at that stage of the game because phenylethylamine is pouring out in large quantities. By the way, when we look at the inspiration of Ellen White, there were a lot of couples that came to her for advice. And she got tired of that aspect of counseling because she found out they weren't really coming for her advice, they were coming for permission. And that's what they were insisting on. And when you have phenylethylamine pouring out in large quantities, you're not a very reasonable person. And of course, who wouldn't get a rush with these chemicals running around? This also explains why many people need to be in love. They're addicted to that rush of chemicals, so they go from one relationship to another. Notice how long the phenylethylamine high lasts. From a few months to around how long? 4 years, but what's the average? 18 months. Pretty typical relationship lengths are about the time the passion starts to wear down after this high wears off. Now, we also have a master's course at Weimar on becoming a licensed therapist, and there's a couple of tracks we have. One of them is marriage and family therapy. You can become a licensed marriage and family therapist. And we'll teach this, and you'll learn this often in secular universities as well. The typical stages of marriage. The first stage of marriage is this PEA stage. We call it the stage of what? Euphoria. What would be the second stage of marriage? All right. After that PEA wears off, it's the stage of non-euphoria. So, and of course, the people still love each other. They're still committed to each other. They remember the vows that they've taken. But sometimes they look across the room at their spouse, and wonderful romance feelings do not always come up in their minds and in their hearts. And then they notice some things that they never noticed before that actually make them a little bit irritable at times with their spouse in regards to the spouse's habits that they just never seemed to see before. But in the typical marriage, now fortunately it's not all marriage. We'll tell you how you can actually stay in stage one if you're young enough, or how maybe you can get back to stage one if you've fallen along these stages. But the typical stage of marriage, and this one's not as measurable as far as years, so the non-euphoria starts about 18 months to 4 years later. But this next one can be maybe 10 years. It might be, depending on how you're doing things, particularly in regards to intimacy, it might be very quickly. You might get to this stage in 5 years, or even less. Or it might take 20 or 25 years. But eventually, in the typical stage, you'll then go into this despicable stage. And this is when you can look across the room at your mate, and feelings of hatred can even well up. And you're wondering, what was I thinking when I married this person? Maybe I wasn't thinking. And of course, this is the stage that what happens? Divorce. And of course, they forgot their vows about till death do us part, and the only thing they remember saying at their wedding ceremony was something they never said, but what they remember saying is, until love shall last. And love is not there, and so if love is not there, it seems like the differences are irreconcilable. And so then someone files for divorce. By the way, which biological sex is more likely to file for divorce? It's females. Yeah, by far, actually. Yeah, most divorces are filed by females. Not that the male is guiltless by any means. But many people, when they get to this despicable stage, they're saying to themselves, we have kids, we've got this house together, we've got built up income, divorce is expensive, it's not going to be great for the kids, and so they decide to go to counseling. And that's when our marriage and family therapists, or not just ours, but any marriage and family therapist, tends to be counseling people that are in this despicable stage. And then the marriage and family therapist will say, well, is there anything you like about your spouse? And well, yeah, I mean, this is what I used to like, and yeah, I still like those things. And so the marriage and family therapy courses are primarily trying to get the couples into a stage of toleration. They might assign you a book called Boundaries in Marriage and those sorts of things in order to get this to last. And so the marriage will continue to go on. And if it reaches 50 years, any of you been to a 50-year wedding anniversary? I've been to several of them. I don't know if they were like the ones I attended, but the ones I attended, the individuals that had stuck out this marriage for 50 years were seen as heroes. Can you imagine that she put up with him for 50 plus years? And he put up with her for 50 plus years. What are they talking about? They're talking about this despicable stage of toleration where they were very persistent in having this marriage last. At one of the 50th wedding anniversaries, the woman was asked, did you ever once think of divorce? She said, never once, but I thought of murder many times. Now, is this really the ideal of what God was wanting in marriage? Not at all. Not at all. And where we have a large tendency to go wrong is on the intimacy part and understanding the intimacy. So, one of the things that people don't understand is the problems of what we call superstimulatory sexual practices. This is sexual practices that are not sex by design, or what the secular world calls in their studies. They don't necessarily call it sex by design, although they don't necessarily dislike the term, because they believe we were all designed by evolution, and evolution is about reproduction and lasting, those sorts of things. So they'll even talk about the evolutionary model. The best model for sex, and they've actually studied it, is what we call PVI sex, or what they call PVI sex. You might imagine what PVI stands for. I can't see very well with all the brightness here. Is this an adult audience? Someone said no? Someone says yes. All right, I heard yes from the front, so I'll act on the yes. So the PVI stands for penile vaginal intercourse. And there are ways of climaxing beyond that that are superstimulatory that are going to get that brain and brain chemistry into issues. So we'll also be learning how these practices commonly performed in certain biblical periods result in complications, know the biblical examples that broke the seventh commandment and similar circumstances that lead to this today, and distinguish the different pathways taken by those who heal versus those who don't heal from adverse sexual practices. Now, as I mentioned earlier today, the big emphasis in politics today is about sexual freedom. And they'll define it. Sexual freedom is the license to lawfully live with and have sex with whom you want, when you want, how you want, without social, political, medical, or cultural persecution. Sexual freedom. This is a quote from the Sexual Freedom site that's really influenced politics today. One party has virtually totally embrace this. Sexual freedom lies at the heart of human dignity, equality, and civil liberties, embodied in both the U.S. Constitution and a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'm sorry, this is not embodied in the U.S. Constitution. I actually teach one class in the academy at Weimar. It's a senior class, and it's called Government. We go over the entire Constitution. We go over the whole Bill of Rights. We go through all the amendments. There's not a single protection that's there. Now, there are maybe legislative types of things, but most of these things are not embodied in the legislature at all. The legislature and the laws of this land are still very counter to sexual freedom. But what's happened is judges have decided, since the legislature hasn't acted, that they will legislate from the bench. And so they are passing precedents to have sexual freedom be primary. But, look at this. Sexual freedom is the license to lawfully live with and have sex with whom you want. I mean, what if that's a 6-year-old? What if the 6-year-old decides that that's something that they want too? And how do we know that the 6-year-old's actually deciding that? And so you will, everyone has lines that they don't think should be crossed sexually. But when they state their platitudes, they act like everything should be allowed. And of course, CNN, places like CNN, I saw an article published the other day that we should not be calling these people pedophiles. They should be called minor attracted persons. Because there is no such thing as sexual deviancy. All sex, as long as it's consensual, should be fine. And it should be part of our civil liberties. And all forms of sex, no matter how you want to do it, whatever. And it comes back to a song that was actually about heterosexual sex, but it was a song when I was growing up. America's been being programmed, and what I should say, groomed, for a long time through Hollywood and other ways. But this was a song that I liked as a kid growing up. I know I'll date myself this way as well. You light up my life. You give me strength to carry on. You light up my day. Yeah, you guys got the tune there. It's a nice tune. I liked it as well. Does anyone remember how that tune ended? It can't be wrong when it feels so right, because you light up my life. So I realized it sounded good, but when that phrase came in, it can't be wrong when it feels so right, this is not talking about exclusive intimacy in a marriage relationship. This is talking about something that many people might view as wrong, but it can't be wrong when it what? Feels so right. And that commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, it doesn't say thou shalt not commit adultery unless you feel like it. And this is what we call emotional reasoning. This whole idea, it can't be wrong when it feels so right. By the way, speaking of laws that are still enforced in sexuality today, I probably should go over those. There are still laws against rape. Of course, that's not consensual. There's laws against nudity. Now just in public, and against nudity in most places. And there's laws against photographed nudity in children. There's laws against adultery, still on the books, although they're not being enforced and being eliminated. That's part of our problem, is not enforcing these laws that were actually there to protect our happiness in society. Although there are still states, of course it's been a few years ago. I'd moved from Oklahoma 8 years ago, but before I moved, a surgeon there and a nurse anesthetist who were both married to other partners, hooked up, and the surgeon stole away the nurse anesthetist, and the husband who had lost her sued him because those laws are still on the books. Thou shalt not commit adultery. And the lawsuit awarded this gentleman $1 million from this surgeon. Do you think that might have deterred the surgeon if he'd have known about that ahead of time? I can tell you, I don't think it was worth $1 million. But I can tell you, it made notice in Oklahoma, and other surgeons were taking notice. There were laws against homosexuality and bestiality, but these have been mostly eliminated or not enforced. But interesting, despite all the grooming that Hollywood has tried to do, and our politicians have tried to do, there was a survey that came out recently, and it showed that 81% of Americans state they agree that people should not commit adultery. That's still a supermajority. 88% of Christians believed it, and 71% of agnostics and atheists believed it. That's also a supermajority. A supermajority is when you get over 2/3. And so the supermajority of Americans still believe in the commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, at least when they're asked if they believe it. Now in practice, obviously, it's not quite that high. So where does all this lead, this whole sexual freedom? One of the things it leads to, and that's been going on for a long time, started majorly in the hippie generation that I grew up in, cohabiting instead of marriage. This has been looked at now. There's been enough where we can do comparison trials of those that cohabited before marriage versus those who did not have sex before marriage, what we call chastity before marriage. 73% of couples now cohabitate actually before they get married. That's a supermajority doing that. Studies show that if you're one of those 73%, you're more likely to get married to a person who is not the best match. And it usually would not have happened if you hadn't been cohabiting. Now, some of that just stands for logic and reason. The reason why they're not getting married is because they're still not sure. At least one of them's not sure if the other one's really the one. But it's kind of like, well, let's try it out. I remember as a teenager, one of the hippies telling me, you know, we try out shoes before we wear them, and so we need to try out sex before we get married to somebody. I mean, I've been a doctor for many, many years. And I still haven't found a couple where it doesn't fit. So it doesn't quite, it's not quite like a shoe. But once you decide to cohabit, do you think that limits your possible choices of those that might be a better mate? Absolutely it does. The ones who would think, you know, I would really like that person, but they're already in a relationship. There's no way I'm going to even let myself be available for that. And so you limit your choices severely when you do this try-on type of thing. And studies show during your cohabitation, as well as if you decide to get married afterwards, which many of them do decide to get married because they've limited their options so severely. And it's kind of like we've been doing this for a while, and now we have a kid or two, and, you know, we better just go ahead and do it. But studies show lower marital satisfaction, lower dedication to each other, lower commitment, lower confidence, and less what? Less intimate satisfaction. They did it in order to try to get that satisfaction, but they have far less intimate satisfaction than those who were not having sex before they got married. Their communication is more negative, and their divorce rates significantly higher. In fact, when it comes to sex before marriage, this was a study done by the by Utah. I don't know if I have it on here or not, so I'll just state it because it's probably not in this presentation. But they said the most divorce-proof couples are those who did not have sex with anyone before entering their marriage relationship. In other words, they were completely sexually naive when they made those vows. And they call them divorce-proof. Part of it is there's no comparison on how somebody else might have made them feel or whatever, and all of those sorts of things. And the more sex you've had before marriage with more partners, the greater the chance that marriage is not going to last. Then we have childhood sexual abuse. I mentioned all that at an all-time high. Depression is increased significantly if you've had child sexual abuse. So is anxiety. So is suicidal ideation. So are suicide attempts. So is your risk of getting involved in alcohol dependency and illicit drug dependency. And if you've had child sexual encounters, you're much more likely to have sex outside of marriage. And so you have much younger sexual encounters. This is all in everybody, even before age 30. But by the time the person has age 30, they have much higher risk of PTSD, decreased sense of their own self-worth, decreased life satisfaction, need for more doctor visits, and of course have had more sexual partners. The p-values on all of these things were less than 0.02 if you know what statistics is. So this was high degree of confidence that these are caused by this. But the one that had the strongest confidence, less than 0.01, the boldest of all the indicators, was this: decreased life satisfaction. I'm telling you, there should be an absolute moratorium on sexual abuse of children. And there should be significant, these are laws that need to be enforced because you're decreasing their life satisfaction for life. And notice also, after age 30, they have a much higher likelihood of being a welfare recipient. I can tell you the reason why our country is in debt primarily is due to sexual freedom. We don't look at it that way, but you look at it and all the issues that government has to pay for due to lack of sexual freedom is significant. Well, in Cambridge, Dr. Unwood studied 86 societies and sexual laws, going back in time over ancient time periods as well as the present time. And he found increased sexual constraints, either pre or post-nuptial, always led to increased flourishing of a culture. Conversely, increased sexual freedom always led to what? The collapse of a culture. But how long did it take? 3 generations. It's not an immediate effect. This is why we have a hard time reasoning from cause to effect. But all of this aspect of sexual freedom and affirming people in sexual freedom. By the way, this is one of the things that I'm concerned about, even in regards to our own institutions. I told you I was at a college university event. I was sitting next to the president of USC San Jose and some other USC people. It was primarily our accreditor, which is based there in California and Hawaii. So it was a whole president's meeting, and they said there were more presidents at this meeting than they had ever had at any previous meeting, because they were talking about university contracts. Why was there such an interest? Because the US government decided to line up 79 more mandates for universities in regards to how they do contracts. And there was a lot of complaints. They put it out in February. They said this is going to be enforced in May. They got so many complaints that they decided not to enforce it. Biden administration pulled back. And then they said it's going to be in September and all of this. And so we had 3 attorneys there talking to us about all of these mandates and all of the things that we're going to have to do. But before they started talking to us, they stood up and they said this: the U.S. government, by law, cannot tell you how to educate anybody in your higher education institution. And mouths dropped open, then why are we sitting here? They've just put all these mandates. They said, but they can mandate it if they're giving you government funds. All the Title IXs, all the Title IVs, they're there because the government is giving student loans to the students, they're giving government grants, you're accepting government money into your institution, and that's why you have to obey the Title IXs, the Title IVs, and all that sort of things. And some of those mandates have to do with enforcing employment of those that are exhibiting their sexual freedom and flaunting it before everybody and even being proud about it, but it's going directly contrary to the teachings of the Spirit of God on who we should hire at our institutions and who should be enrolled there. And so we have these people, they're giving so much money that there's Title IV coordinators, there's Title IX coordinators, all going around fearful that the government money is going to be withdrawn. And so we've got to do this and we've got to do that. Now, when we first got accredited, because they're so used to it, most institutions get accredited so that they can access the government funds. Because that's how you really make money as an educational institution. Get your accreditation, then get your government funds flowing this way. Weimar University got accredited. We got the highest level of accreditation that could be there. But we decided not to accept $1 of government funds. So after that meeting, I asked, because the accreditor was there too, and I said, you know, last time we had to fill out compliance of Title IX and Title IV. You wanted to see that as part of the accreditation. We just learned here today that if we don't accept government funds, we don't have to do any of those things. Why are you asking us to be compliant? And she says, you know, that's a good thing. You guys don't have to fill out any of that stuff. She says, you're an unusual university. You don't accept any government funds. She says, you might be the only one in this area. Now, it makes us leaner. We don't have there's no church subsidies, there's no government subsidies. We have to have a lean organization. But we can be unapologetically biblical and uncompromisingly scientific, and we don't have to have students be confused about safe zones for those who are practicing their sexual freedom and flaunting it, destroying themselves and destroying others. Now, we do take those people into our program because they have high rates of depression and anxiety. We take atheists into our program, but we don't hire them to teach our students. We don't hire them to exhibit their false teachings that will damage people in the program. And so there's a distinct difference. And by the way, when they come to our program, and you might think that they're all, because this is all politically charged, that they're going to be very against us, etc. Once they see how much we care for them, and they will say that, in the 10 days that they'll be there, they'll say, I have never been so tenderly cared for my entire life as I have in these 10 days. You guys are wonderful. They'll even try to test us to see if we're fake or not. This has got to be fake, you know. Maybe I can provoke them a little bit or whatever. And then they realize these are real people that are the genuine care. And then we show them the true science. We don't have to even show them the Bible. And then they're asking in the counseling sessions, I think I've damaged myself a lot. And it's my lifestyle, isn't it? Can you help me to know how to get out of this lifestyle? It's one thing to get in it, but if I try to get out, I'm going to be severely persecuted by my friend group. And how can I get out of this lifestyle? And so the Lord can help all of us to have our brains changed for the better. So we wonder, you know, you look around and you realize there's a collapse of the American culture going on. But very few people are aware that this is the source of it. The highest flourishing of a culture, the most powerful combination was prenuptial chastity coupled with what? Absolute monogamy. These cultures were rational, and if they retained this combination for at least 3 generations, so it takes 3 generations of retaining it, they exceeded all other cultures in every area, including literature, art, science, furniture, architecture, engineering, and agriculture. Have we wondered why our country is so great? Yes, it's based on religious freedom, freedom of speech, the freedom of Americas. But the reason why our country really got great is because it wasn't based on sexual freedom at all. We taught these things, and this was taught to our children, to those that came over on the Mayflower, every Puritan. By the way, one of the things I learned about teaching government is one of the reasons why the Puritans came to America, they wanted to practice the Bible without any encumbrances from government telling them they couldn't. And one of the encumbrances that would perturb them is the mandate that if you got married, you had to wear a wedding ring. In Europe, it was obligatory. And so the Puritans came over so they could have their absolute monogamy without wearing jewelry. So, you know, I know there's kind of a talk and a controversy in our church about that, but if you want to stand up for American freedom and biblical ideals, you can be like the Puritans were. Only 3 out of 86 cultures that he studied ever attained to that level, however. Only 3. One of them was America. Of course, one of them was the nation of Israel that exhibited that, and there was another as well. If total sexual freedom was embraced by a culture, that culture collapsed within 3 generations to the lowest state of flourishing, which Unwin described as inert and as a dead level of conception. This is characterized by people who have little interest in much else other than their what? Their own wants and needs. They become very self-focused and not other-focused. At this level, the culture is usually conquered or taken over by another culture with greater social energy. So let's talk about supernormal stimuli. A supernormal stimulus or stimulus is an exaggerated version of a stimulus to which there is an existing response tendency, or any stimulus that elicits a response more strongly than the stimulus for which it evolved. One of the supernormal stimuli, they'll talk about this, one of the supernormal stimuli in our society today is the smartphone. That's why it's so distracting, as we talked about the other day. And we get on there, and it has some adverse consequences. It's a super normal stimuli. It actually attracts us in ways that natural objects never could. But another supernormal stimulus is sexual practices outside of natural PVI. Now, these are secular researchers, evolutionists, not religious at all. Penile vaginal intercourse is better. And their subtitle is Evidence Trumps Ideology. In other words, the ideology is it doesn't matter what type of sex you're having or how you're having it, it's all equal, and it should be thought of as equally positive as long as it's consensual. Empirical research demonstrates that different sexual behaviors differ in many physiological and psychological domains. These differences are remarkably consistent in revealing an association between specifically penile vaginal intercourse and the indices of better physiological and psychological function. Other sexual behaviors, and notice they mention them. Masturbation. By the way, masturbation is an all-time high in our society. It is frequently done by both males and females today. Partner masturbation. Oral sex, anal sex, or any other sex that excludes penile vaginal intercourse are negatively related to indices of physiological and psychological function. So they're doing it to climax, but they're actually ruining their mental health, and their emotional intelligence. Dopaminergic pathways underlie processes of romantic attraction. The studies demonstrated that the prolactin surges that modulate dopaminergic function differ greatly between sexual behaviors. Such surges are strongly associated with women's sexual satisfaction resulting from penile vaginal intercourse and not other non-PVI ways of experiencing orgasm. PVI is associated with better physical health as well. Greater resting heart rate variability is associated with orgasms through penile vaginal intercourse, but not with orgasms from other sources. This means healthy vagus nerve activity. Blood pressure response to stress is also better. Relationship satisfaction goes up with PVI, but not with other forms of sex. No other forms of sex and relationship have actually enhanced relationship satisfaction. And you can kind of get an idea of why those that are not practicing PVI start to be looking around. They're not very faithful to each other. We call it, the Supreme Court wants to call it a marriage, but those marriages don't last near as much as, at least if you have the possibility of PVI, which those relationships don't. But you can also have the same thing if you have the possibility of PVI, but you're not doing any PVI as far as climaxing. Other forms of sex do not enhance relationship satisfaction. In fact, data shows they worsen relationship satisfaction over time. What about sex frequency? Is it true that engaging in more frequent sex is associated with greater well-being? Well, the media emphasizes, and research supposedly supports, the claim that the more sex you have, the happier you will be. But only in committed marriage relationships does sex have any enhancing effects. So even if you're having PVI and it's casual sex, it's not enhancing your relationship satisfaction. You have to have that commitment first. That's why God performed that marriage ceremony first. That total 100% commitment to each other. Because then sex will have some beneficial effects. Across 3 studies, notice this is not a small group, 7 people, 10 people, 20 people. It's 30,645. It's a meta-analysis. We demonstrate that the association between sexual frequency and well-being is best described by a curvilinear as opposed to a linear association. So curvilinear means it gets better, but then it gets worse as sex frequency goes up, where sex is no longer associated with well-being at a frequency of more than what? Once a week. Now, it's kind of interesting in the, and I think I mentioned, did I mention Dr. Bauer the other day from Southern or no? Yes or no? Yes, okay. So, Dr. Bauer mentioned that in Acts 15 we were supposed to be keeping the sexual practices of the Mosaic Code. There were 3 things that the Mosaic Code continued in the New Testament. But if we're doing that, there's a period of time in the month when a woman is on her period, and then 7 days afterwards. So you look at that, and that's usually going to be about 12 days where there's no sexual contact happening. Now there's affection. There's all sorts of, they still love each other. They can kiss. They can do all of those things, and those things will still go on naturally. But as far as the ultimate sexual intimacy act, and it's interesting that was kept by all the Israelites, and they had the most faithful society ever recorded in human history, and they lived in tents next to each other. What the studies are telling us is that when you have sex more frequently, particularly when it gets to more than every 4 days, you are going to set yourself up for 3 adverse changes in the brain. This is from too frequent or from non-PVI orgasmic activity. Either one will do this. Desensitization, meaning there's a numb pleasure response. Dopamine and dopamine 2 receptors decline in the brain's reward circuitry. And this leaves the addict less sensitive to pleasure and hungry for dopamine-raising activities and substances of all kinds. More pleasure thus leads to less pleasure. And the intimate act is not as fulfilling, particularly long-term, as it used to be. Sensitization then occurs. You are more irritable with the usual nuisances of life. Remember that stage from euphoria to non-euphoria? Studies show the reason why it goes from euphoria to non-euphoria is those first few years, there's a great tendency to overdo it. And those of us in a marriage relationship understand that. We love each other. We're going to bed together. We're taking our clothes off together. And so sex happens, tends to happen very frequently, and there's no really managing of it or trying to stop it at all. But, but as it, as it goes into that, it won't necessarily happen the first time. You do it in less than 4 days. But when it's repeatedly like that over the course of months and years, you're going to be more irritable with the usual nuisances of life and even more irritable with your spouse. Hypofrontality also occurs. That means your willpower begins to erode. And so interestingly, the couples that cheat on each other very commonly are climaxing far more frequently than they should. Now, this is against what cultural norms tell us. Often, the woman will state, okay, I don't really want to do it, but I'm afraid if I don't, that he's going to try to get it from somewhere else. But actually, by doing it as often as he wants, you're actually setting him up to stray even more. And the studies have been clear on that. What does the Bible? What did the Bible write himself about sex? Thou shalt not commit adultery. These are some of the laws there in Leviticus. And that has to do with uncovering nakedness. And there were not laws against incense. There was laws against viewing the naked body, and so on, that we could go through. It might be worth doing that. And approximately 12 days a month with no sexual relations. And then these laws as well, which were called abominable type of sex. By the way, this whole idea that some people are just born to only want to have abominable sex has been well disproven. CNN and CNBC, the most liberal progressive news networks, when Science Magazine came out with a study of over 1 million gay people, where they've been trying to study what is it about them making them gay. They were looking for genetic things because this whole idea, I was born this way. I think one of your politicians that came from Indiana has propelled that myth as well. And there is no gay gene. Look it up. CNN will have it on the headlines. No gay gene. And you're not born that way genetically. Now, there's environmental things that can propel you to go that area. We could go into those environmental things. Some of them might be even prenatal influences. Some might be whatever. But people are not born that way. And same-sex attractions that are experienced in adolescence, if they're not acted upon, most often go away. And many of these same-sex attractions, I can tell you myself, I might have been thought of as a same-sex attracted person, even though I wasn't thinking about sex when I was 5 years old. I was either 5 or 6. My mother told me about this. And I had a very good friend from across the street. He was the same age as I was, and we did everything together. We played trains together. We played everything together. We got along so good. He had a whole bunch of brothers and sisters, but he and I were as close as could be. And I came home to my mother, and I said, Randall and I have decided when we grow up, we're going to get married. And she said, "No, you're not." I said, "Why?" I said, "We like each other. We do everything together. We just like being with each other all the time. Why can't I marry my friend?" She said, "You'll figure it out." And I'm just thinking, if I would have had a progressive mother at that stage, how it could have pretty much messed me up. But I didn't, thank God. And I did figure it out eventually. But it had nothing to do about sex. We hadn't seen each other's sex organs. We hadn't been doing anything like that. It had nothing to do with that at all. And I mention that because studies do show, and one of the things my mother did, I'll tell you a little bit of setup of why this was the case. My father was an engineer working for General Motors in the daytime, and at night he was teaching engineering classes at Wayne State University. He was a great teacher. He got Teacher of the Year and teaching thermodynamics and all these great engineering classes. And he wasn't home. I would have him home on Sabbath. He came home after I went to bed, and he'd be gone before I got up in the morning. And so I'd get to know him on Sabbath and things, which was fine. But my mother, after that happened, she didn't tell me about it, but she told him, "You quit your job at Wayne State. You come home. You need to be with this boy." And so he did. And he came home and he started playing catch with me and ball and other things, and my dad and I became very close, and I didn't become near as close to my friend over there. But when you are starving for male attention, which I was with my mother a lot, but when you're starving for male attention growing up, you're going to have more tendencies as far as this same-sex attraction. And it can happen the other way as well, females that are starving for good motherly attraction. So today, of course, we have homes where you don't even have fathers. And so you have a lot of setup for that type of thing. Then you're saying society is telling them it's just as fine if you're that way or not, and so, why don't you go ahead and do it? But they don't know about these adverse effects. By the way, there's a book written on even a lot more adverse effects. It's called The Adverse Effects of Homosexuality. It might be called The Health Effects of Homosexuality. It's actually printed by Massachusetts researchers there in Massachusetts. But the world's not telling you that there's anything adverse about it. But, and it's not just adverse of homosexuality. Remember, these three things can happen in a heterosexual relationship as well, and often do. So, the Bible says, "This is the will of God, even your sanctification, that ye should abstain from" what? Fornication. And that is interpreted in many of the new translations, sexual immorality. Jesus also mentions God's will for us. "I say to you that whosoever looketh on a woman to do" what? "Lust after her, hath committed adultery with her already in his heart." It's not just the behavior, it's the desire and intent. We must ask ourselves the question, would I do it if I could get by with it? If the answer is yes, then there's a need for a thorough conversion of the heart. Both the Old and New Testament condemn Sodom and the sexual practices of Sodom. The term sodomy encompasses having sexual climax not by design. And if you look at all the forms of sodomy, that's really what it's talking about. And the U.S. has had strict laws against sodomy in virtually all of the states. Why did they have laws against sodomy? Starting back in the 1700s and 1800s, it was there to protect the women in their intimate relationships. And so it was actually for the protection of women that those laws were there. So non-PVI sexual practices include sodomy, bestiality, of course, That's anal sex as well. So too frequent PVI with spouse, or inappropriate time with a spouse, or displaying nudity of someone who is not your spouse, sexually lusting after a person not your spouse. Those are all adverse sexual practices according to the Bible. But the Bible encourages PVI sexual intercourse at the right times, after marriage. And it came right there in Genesis 1 where it says what? Be fruitful and multiply. It advises married people to not withhold themselves sexually from each other for long periods of time unless agreed on by both parties. Now, we do have people that come to our program that have been having it too frequently in the wrong type, and they're heterosexual and they're in a marriage, and often their marriage is messed up. In fact, I should tell you, I won't tell you the names here, but we had a woman come through our program who was getting ready to divorce her husband, 3 small children, and she was working in a hospital in an intense job, making good money. Her husband was more of a maintenance guy, but stay-at-home guy who was raising the girls. And she was having problems in the work. In fact, she almost found out that she was going to get fired. OCD kind of out of control. And so she comes to our program, and she's compliant with her OCD. She puts everything into practice. And she learns about these things as well and realizes what was happening in her own marriage relationship that was deteriorating the marriage on the intimacy part of things. And so she decided she was actually going to she had dropped out of the church as well. But she decided she wanted to embrace everything, including the spiritual part. So her husband actually came for her baptism on the last Sabbath there in Moses Rock, but she got rebaptized. And as they're on their way home, she says to him, we advise them not to do this, but she says to him, no sex for you, bud, for 90 days. Now, we do recommend it takes 90 days of reboot. If you've been doing it the wrong way or you've been doing it too frequently, it'll take 90 days for those dopamine receptors to all come back. It'll take, very positive brain chemical changes will be noted. And this is well known from the secular literature as well. Just look up 90-day sex fast. Even Hollywood married couples are going through it and all that. And they'll write about it. It's worth writing about. And they'll write about how they actually became more affectionate to their wife and how they just, couldn't get their wife off their mind and how they were looking forward to it. But even at the end of 90 days, they don't just jump into it right away. They want to have it be a special event. So they'll even delay it a few more days to have it be that special, and then they'll be doing it about every week, as the science says is helpful. But she had clearly gotten better mentally, but now he was very upset. And so what was important for him was to know what she knew, which he didn't know at that point. And so they got online and saw one of the videos on it, and he was still upset after watching the video, but after about a week he came to her and he says, you're exactly right, that's exactly what I need. And so let's do it. And their marriage afterwards has never been, it's been great since that time, but their marriage improved to a point where it had never been, even in the euphoric stage as they got married. So the euphoria went up and it stayed there. And now it's been, almost 3 years since they've been through the program. And they are believers, as everyone is, that goes through this reboot, who's willing to do that. So this is where you actually don't withhold yourself sexually from each other unless agreed upon by what? And partners need to be educated. So we ask the spouse that's there to go home with the DVD or the CD to show their other spouse and have a discussion about it. So there's a lot of biblical principle deviations regarding sex. We could go into a lot of those aspects of things. Lot's daughters, even. They were so contaminated by sodomy, and we need to understand our young people are being contaminated by essentially the Sodom that's around us today. And even after they escaped and got away from it, those sexual practices were still ingrained in themselves. And when they didn't have anyone out there in the mountains to marry, they decided they still wanted to have children. And so incest is what they did after making their dad drunk and all of that. And that's how the Moabites came about, that were persecutors of Israel. And we see all these others that are mentioned, but we also see others like the case of Joseph. Joseph was older, or Potiphar's wife was older than Joseph, but not by a big difference, according to the scholars. And after he began to work for them all over the house, he's not only the most obedient servant ever, he is so cheerful and caring. Besides, he's the best looking guy I think I've ever seen. I'll make myself irresistible. And so she read the red books of the day to know how to make herself irresistible. She followed him around the house in her cute little revealing outfits, dropping hints here and there. What did he have to gain if he did this? On the surface, more fun, special secret with the wife of the boss. He'll rise in influence and status. She'll definitely be his advocate. More money will likely come his way. And maybe, just maybe, she might dump her hubby, and half of all Potiphar's would end up being his. What did he have to lose if he didn't do it? His status. She's going to get angry. His job. His very life could actually end with capital punishment. And I've noticed those who are taken advantage of, as Joseph was attempted to be taken advantage of, often have some feelings of guilt, because after they go over what happened even years later, they realize they could have done more to prevent it or stop it and call out the perpetrator immediately. That doesn't mean that Joseph would have been primarily to blame. It's always the older individual who is primarily to blame. They're the ones that are experienced. But often they're afraid, and the pro-con list seems weighted too much to one side, and they have been manipulated, and they do it. Notice what Ellen White says when Potiphar came with everything she got now, Potiphar's wife, to Joseph. This temptation, so sudden, so strong, so seductive, how should it be met? Joseph knew well what would be the consequence of resistance. On the one hand were concealment, favor, and rewards. On the other, disgrace, imprisonment, perhaps even death. His whole future life depended upon the decision of the moment. Would principle triumph? Would Joseph still be true to God? Notice this phrase. With inexpressible anxiety. Who had anxiety? With inexpressible anxiety, angels looked upon the scene. They were very anxious because they hadn't seen young men be able to stay free from that type of manipulation. And so they're thinking, Joseph, what is he going to do? How is he going to respond? And by saying this temptation, so sudden, so strong, so seductive, means that Joseph was actually attracted to her. If there was no attraction, it wouldn't have been a temptation. But instead, David, he was already taking off his clothes, forcing herself on him, and he got up and ran with his clothes partially removed. And then she had the evidence to say that he tried to rape her. Who actually was trying to rape who? Then we have the opposite case of David. And this tells us sometimes these sins can happen to otherwise good people. David was popular, he was kind, he was winsome and wise, he was courageous, he was free in his emotional expressions and seeking and praising God. But with his success, he began to experience more what? Idleness. It's normally when kings are out to war, but he wasn't out to war. He was in his nice home, looking around, and he saw this naked woman on TV, and he began to inquire, who is this girl? It was the spirit of self-confidence and self-exaltation that prepared the way for David's fall. Flattery and the subtle allurements of power and luxury were not without effect upon him. Intercourse with surrounding nations also exerted an influence for evil. And of course, those intercourse with surrounding nations, as kings had the right to anyone they wanted to have the right with, too. And that's why David didn't quite fully understand what he had done. Contaminated by the culture of the nations around him, he also forgot the commandment that says, thou shalt not commit adultery. It doesn't say unless you're the king. And then Nathan came to him and said, you are the man. After his sin was pointed out by Nathan, he had a choice. Go into denial or defensiveness or take responsibility. What did he do? He took responsibility, chose the path of redemption, and fortunately he pled for forgiveness and admitted his complete mess up. And we know he was thoroughly converted because of this, a couple of incidents, but this was one. When he's now escaping from his throne so that there wouldn't be a civil war and a lot of death, when Absalom is now taking over, he saw in his own hand the cause of his trouble. The words of the prophet Micah breathed the spirit that inspired David's heart. When I sit in darkness, the Lord shall be a light unto me. I will bear the indignation of the Lord because I have sinned against him until he plead my case and execute judgment for me. And the Lord did not forsake David. So, by the way, Shimei, as he's leaving, Shimei is hurling insults, telling him what he did with Bathsheba, how wrong it was. He was going into a lot of truth. And I've seen people, when this happens, they start blaming the other person and saying, hey, I asked God for forgiveness. I'm over this. You're bringing this up again. You're the one that's wrong. All of this kind of stuff. David never did that. Shimei was saying all these things. Then he was exhibiting lies on top of it, saying, you were against Saul all the time. You wanted Saul's throne, and now he's adding lies on truths of all of the bad of David. And his men are so upset about it. Joab says, let me be the executor of judgment on this guy. He's lying about you. He's embarrassing you in public. He's doing all those things. And David says, you leave that man alone. You leave that man alone because I deserve everything I'm getting. That was a sign that he had truly repented. Notice this, the Lord did not forsake David. This chapter in his experience, when under the cruelest wrong and insult, he shows himself to be humble, unselfish, generous, and submissive, is one of the noblest in his whole experience. Never was the ruler of Israel more truly great in the sight of heaven than at this hour of his deepest outward humiliation. So David was actually closer to the Lord then than he had ever been. There's more examples I could go into. Maybe I'll just go into this one quickly. Sodom. By the way, Lot almost lost his life by those Sodomites. Do you remember why? He was trying to protect his new friends from their abuse. But then he said to them as they were trying to knock the door down, "Why are you going to do this what?" Remember what it was? Wickedness. Ooh, did they get upset about that? Do you remember what they said? Who made you to be a judge over us? In other words, why are you saying this is wrong? This is perfectly legitimate. It's perfectly right. We're just exhibiting our sexual freedom, and we're going to show them things that they'll actually enjoy. They just don't know that they're going to enjoy it, and so we're going to do this on them. But because he said it was wrong, they would have killed him on the spot. Ellen White says they would have actually torn him limb from limb and ripped him apart. That's how angry they were. But God protected him, and those people were blind. Jesus also condemned Sodom, but he stated the judgments of Capernaum would be even worse. They had access to the author and displayer of truth and love and rejected him. He said that these works of mercy and healing, had they been performed in Sodom and Gomorrah would have never been destroyed. Notice it's the health message and the healing message that protects these cities by responding to it. This is why God wants us to take our message of healing around the world. Sodom's stated belief in sexual freedom, they said, would bring all sorts of greatness, but it actually brought lack of freedom and coercion on the party being manipulated. And it brought a judgment of death in the most cruel manner for the exercise of freedom of speech that Lot was exhibiting, his freedom of speech to even say that. So sex apart from God's plan for it is self-centered and manipulative. Might be worth memorizing. Sex apart from God's plan for it is what? Self-centered and manipulative. So the solution is to repent. Might be a sex fast. We call it no PMO. What does no PMO for 90 days mean? No pornography, no masturbation, no orgasm. 90 consecutive days. It doesn't take long for the brain to heal. Phenomenal enhancing cognitive and emotional health for those that have been overdoing it. Enhanced relationships in marriage, family, and outside of marriage. So the gospel was displayed to the woman caught in adultery. He ended up saying to her, "Neither do I condemn thee." But he told her to do what? Go and sin no more. In other words, change your ways, change your heart, take hold of my love and obey my commandments I gave you in love. The push and promotion of sexual freedom results in sexual slavery. It results in cognitive and emotional instability. And the freedom to speak of the truth and data concerning this is now greatly suppressed in this country and ruthlessly attacked, even though it is scientific, resulting in further innocent victims becoming enslaved. So to free people from slavery requires the proclamation of scientific truth, but it also requires humility and spiritual renewal. And that can start with the study of the Word of God. Those who are healed and freed versus those who don't and remain enslaved, there's a big difference. And we've actually studied this in thousands that have come through our program in emotional intelligence, depression, anxiety. It's well documented. But once again, it's worth tasting and seeing that the Lord is good. Right before he gave us the commandments, he said, "I am the Lord that brought you out of" what? Bondage. In other words, trust me when I say do not commit adultery in your behavior or even in your heart, because I am the Lord that healeth thee. And then positive neuroplasticity can occur in anyone despite what they have done previous. I have this little song here. Out out of depression and sorrow. Lift up my spirit, I pray. Lord, turn my gloom and my darkness into the sunshine of day. It's to the tune of Whispering Hope. I have no trust in my feelings, rather I'll trust in your word. The greatest fact that I treasure is that you love me, dear Lord. Lord of all hope, we will trust in your word. It gives us power to endure and stand firm. Thank you for bearing my shame, Lord, breaking its stronghold in me, binding my wounds up forever. Now by your truth I'm set free. Once I was ruled by my temper, angry and bitter within. Now I know peace and forgiveness, freedom from bondage and sin. Lord of all hope, we will trust in your word. It gives us power to endure and stand firm. I, anxious torment, once suffered, based on deception and lies. I now, your promises trusting, and by your truth am made wise. Practicing over and over your faithful word to declare, your truth my mind is renewing. This truth with others I'll share. Lord of all hope, we will trust in your word. It gives us power to endure and stand firm. That poem was actually written by a participant of depression and anxiety recovery who got out of it and followed our recommendations and is enduring and standing firm, and the anxiety and depression is gone. Any questions about this before we close? Don't be bashful. Yes.
I will give you an example. So, is this family, he is working far away. He is coming home Friday night, afternoon. And he is going back to his work Sunday morning. And it looks like they have sex Friday night or during the Sabbath time. What do you think about this?
Okay. The question is about sexual intimacy on the Sabbath. And I know that's not a lot of controversy in this country, but I know in where my wife grew up, in Romania, it is interpreted as doing your own pleasures, you know, and you know, and so he does have some non-Sabbath hours to utilize. So it's not, it doesn't have to be during the Sabbath time. But, you know, the Sabbath experience is to be with God. I think if there is another time, and I'm not going to make a hard and fast rule, but I think if there is another time to do it, where we can experience the full benefit of the Sabbath without all of that aspect of intimacy, but God is the author of that intimacy. There are some people that say, well, Eve and Adam got married on Friday, so we know what they were doing on Sabbath. I don't think we know that. I mean, often it's actually better to get to know someone before you do that. They only met for a few minutes. Really? So we don't know that. And so we can't assume those things. But how that's interpreted, I don't know that we're given a whole lot of insight on how to do that. But I certainly want to have the Sabbath experience be the best, and also have the times for intimacy, because we are told to be intimate. And it's not just about reproduction. Some people say, well, this was just about reproduction. No, there are positive things that happen. I didn't go into it. For instance, if it's committal sex, you have oxytocin. Oxytocin is a bonding chemical, so it helps with that overall bonding. If you're having PVI sex, they mentioned prolactin. Prolactin prevents the dopamine receptors from being ripped off from this extremely intimate and pleasurable activity together. And so you don't get the prolactin if you're doing the casual sex. And so the dopamine receptors started to get ripped off. So those are all things that we learn when we do the 4-day aspect of things. But I would say if we can do it on non-Sabbath hours, it might be even more beneficial. All right, there's a question over here. Yes.
What is the average age that a young person who experienced sexual inappropriateness usually start to deal with it?
So if they've been maybe sexually inappropriate growing up, when is the average age when they start to deal with it?
Yes, if something has been done to them.
If something has been done, in most cases, it's years later. It's a big secret. They're keeping it a secret. They're thinking that somehow I'm going to be able to get by with this. It's not really damaging to me. And it's not till years later that they recognize, actually, this was very damaging to me. And then when they start realizing it's very damaging, that's when they start talking to counselors and things, but usually they're not talking to counselors right away. And so often it doesn't occur till about their 30, you know. And around age 30, we start hearing about all of this, and then they're having to go back and to be able to deal with this. And we have to teach them how to not have mental filters and how to be able to grow, and also how to be appropriate and not inappropriate guilt. Many people have all sorts of inappropriate guilt, you know. They're 6 years old and it happened and they're feeling guilty about it. I'm sorry, they shouldn't feel guilty at all. And so the inappropriate guilt part is very part of the healing process as well as what caused all this. But not to get this whole, you know, what we have today is this Me Too movement who is so ruthless. One of the stories I could have told you if I'd had time. Mary, who was the prostitute that was caught in adultery. Mary was set up for all of that lifestyle by who? It was her uncle. Her uncle had abused her. And it was very wrong, and he was a Pharisee. He ended up developing leprosy. Christ healed him from his leprosy. And then he's over at Simon's house as a thank you for this banquet. And Mary comes and washes her feet with the perfume, and all of that drama is taking place. And Simon is critical of Christ, saying if he knew what kind of woman that was, he wouldn't allow her to do that. He read his thoughts, and he could have exposed him. But he did not expose him. And instead, he tried to reach his heart. And he told this parable. We don't have time to go into the parable. But Desire of Ages gives that whole story. It's worth reading. And Desire of Ages, he knew that Christ had protected him from public humiliation. And he recognized that he was a greater sinner than Mary. And he gave his heart to the Lord as a result of that parable. And both of them became true followers of Christ and Christians. That's not how we treat perpetrators today. We tend to cause, yes, and they should pay for their penalties and their sins, but they also should be offered forgiveness. And Christ went after both. He didn't just go after, he felt very compassionate about Mary because Mary was less guilty than Simon. And it wasn't like he wasn't angry and upset at Simon over what Simon had done. He was very upset about it, but he knew that both brains could change. And I wish we had that attitude in our churches today. It's not just the victim. We need to really be dealing with the perpetrators as well in bringing them to repentance and to be a follower of Christ, because they can change as well. Well, I've gone too long. Sorry for the next seminar. I've gone over it.